The wind didn't just whisper across the Dakota frontier, it screamed. It tore dust from the scorched earth and threw it in Clara Remington's face, a gritty punctuation to the silence that had fallen over her life. The funeral was over. Her husband, Samuel, was in the ground. The neighbors had all gone home, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They'd offered their condolences, their casseroles, and their unwanted advice. "You're a young woman, Clara," one had said, her voice dripping with faux sympathy. "You'll find another man soon enough." As if a husband was a broken plow, easily replaced. But Clara hadn't cried, not a single tear, not when they told her Samuel had been kicked in the head by a spooked horse, not when they lowered the pine box into the dry, unforgiving dirt. She just stood there, a black-clad statue, the veil hiding the cold, hard clarity in her eyes, because Clara knew something the others didn't. Samuel's death wasn't an accident. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and rust, she walked the perimeter of her property. Her property, now. Not theirs. Hers. She carried a rifle, not out of fear, but out of habit. This land was in her bones, but tonight, every shadow seemed to stretch a little longer. Every gust of wind sounded like a warning. The official story was simple, a tragic accident. Samuel, a man known for his heavy hand and short temper, had gotten too close to a new stallion. The horse lashed out, a single brutal kick, case closed. The sheriff hadn't even stayed for coffee, but Clara had seen the horse that morning. It was calm, placid even, and she'd seen Samuel's boots. They were clean, too clean for a man who'd supposedly been working in a dusty corral. There was no mud, no scuff marks, and then there was the matter of his wallet. It was empty. Samuel always carried a thick wad of cash. Always. She paused at the edge of the tree line, where the land dipped down towards the river, a place Samuel had forbidden her from going. He'd said it was dangerous, full of snakes and worse, and that's when she saw him, a figure on a painted horse, sitting perfectly still against the dying light. He was Cheyenne. His silhouette was sharp, unmistakable. He wasn't hiding. He was watching. Her heart didn't leap with fear. It hammered with a cold, electric shock of something else entirely. Recognition. The neighbors would have screamed. They would have raised their rifles. Shoot first, ask questions never, was the unwritten law of the frontier. Clara didn't move a muscle. The man on the horse didn't reach for a weapon. He simply looked at her, his gaze cutting through the dusk, through the lies, through the charade of her grief. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement. Then, without a sound, he turned his horse and melted back into the trees. Clara stood there for a long time, the rifle feeling heavy and useless in her hands. The wind whipped her veil, but she didn't feel it. She wasn't thinking about the coyotes howling in the distance. She was thinking about the man's eyes and the story they were telling, a story far more interesting than the one the sheriff had written in his report, because this wasn't the first time she'd seen him. She'd seen him 2 days before the funeral, watching her house from that same spot, right around the time Samuel was supposed to have had his accident. The next morning, the sun beat down with a vengeance, bleaching the sky to a pale, unforgiving blue. Clara was already at it, splitting logs with a fury that made her muscles scream. The pain was good. It was real. It was something she could control, unlike the web of secrets that was tightening around her farm. She wasn't alone for long. Just before noon, a wagon rattled up her drive. It was Mrs. Elcott, her face a permanent mask of pinched concern, a freshly baked pie in her hands. The pie was a Trojan horse, a sweet-smelling excuse to pry. "Clara, dear," she began, her eyes darting around the property, cataloging every detail. "You shouldn't be out here all by your lonesome. It's not safe." She set the pie on the porch railing like it was a holy offering. "There are stories, you know. Sightings. Indians near the river. Getting bolder. Clara just nodded, her mind a million miles away. She was thinking about the man on the horse, the calm in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a raider. It was the look of a witness. She hadn't told a soul about him, not the sheriff, not Mrs. Elcott. It was a secret she held close, a single sharp stone in her pocket. "You'll need to think about protection," Mrs. Elcott pressed on, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That Langley boy, Jack, he's a strong lad. Good family. He's been asking after you. Says he'd be willing to help you manage the farm." Clara's stomach churned. Jack Langley, a man with greedy eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. He'd been circling her land like a vulture even before Samuel's body was cold. He wanted the farm. Everyone knew it had the best water access in the county. "I can take care of myself, Martha," Clara said, her voice flat and final. Mrs. Elcott's lips tightened. Pride is a cold companion, Clara. A woman alone is a target. The veiled threat hung in the air long after the wagon had disappeared in a cloud of dust. Clara knew what she meant. A target for Cheyenne, yes, but also a target for men like Jack Langley. That night, she didn't just walk the property line. She searched it, inch by inch. She went to the corral where Samuel had supposedly met his end. The ground was hard-packed, undisturbed, no sign of a struggle, no sign of a spooked horse. She made her way to the tree line, to the spot where she'd seen the Cheyenne rider. The air was still. The world held its breath. And then she saw it. Tucked into the hollow of an old cottonwood tree, almost invisible in the deep shadows, was a small bundle wrapped in buckskin. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked around, scanning the darkness. Nothing. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it. Inside wasn't dried meat or berries. It wasn't a gift. It was a message. It was Samuel's pocket watch, the one he was never without. The silver casing was dented, the glass cracked, but it was his, and tucked beneath it was a single dark feather, a crow's feather. Clara stared at it, the blood draining from her face. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation to the truth. The Cheyenne hadn't just seen something. He was showing her what he knew. Samuel hadn't been killed by a horse. He'd been here, at the tree line, the place he'd forbidden her to go, and he hadn't been alone. The arrival of Sheriff Brody the next afternoon felt less like a follow-up and more like an intrusion. He was a big man, soft around the middle, with a face that tried too hard to be friendly. He tipped his hat, his eyes lingering on Clara a moment too long. "Just checking in, Mrs. Remington," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Wanted to make sure you were holding up all right." "I'm as well as can be expected, Sheriff," Clara replied, her voice carefully neutral. She clutched the pocket watch hidden deep in her apron. "Good, good," he nodded, though his eyes were scanning the farm, the barn, the horizon. "Case is officially closed, you know. Tragic business, but these things happen out here." He said it too quickly, too neatly, like he was tidying up a mess he didn't want to look at too closely. "Did you find his wallet, Sheriff?" Clara asked, her voice steady. Brody stiffened just for a second. "Wallet?" "No, ma'am. Figured it got lost in the commotion. Or maybe an animal dragged it off. You know how it is." He knew. He had to know Samuel never went anywhere without his cash. But he was burying it. Why? "And his watch?" Clara pressed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Did you find his silver pocket watch?" The sheriff's folksy smile faltered. He cleared his throat. "No, ma'am. Didn't see no watch. Must have been lost, too." He hooked his thumbs in his belt. "Look, Mrs. Remington, my advice? Sell this place. It's too much for a woman alone. Jack Langley made a fair offer, I hear. You should take it. Move back east. Be safe." It wasn't advice. It was a command, a threat wrapped in concern. He wasn't trying to protect her. He was trying to get rid of her. After he left, a cloud of dust and unanswered questions in his wake, Clara felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. the sheriff, Jack Langley. They were connected somehow, and Samuel's death was the knot that tied them together. That night, she didn't wait on the porch. She walked straight to the tree line, the broken watch in her hand. The moon was a silver slit in a black velvet sky. The world was silent, waiting. He came as before, emerging from the darkness like a ghost. His painted horse was silent, its hooves making no sound on the soft earth. He stopped a dozen paces from her, his eyes fixed on her face. Clara held up the watch. He dismounted in one fluid motion. He didn't speak. He just walked toward her, his presence immense, powerful. He stopped just out of arm's reach. He raised a hand, palm open, a sign of peace. Then he pointed a single finger, not at the watch, but at the ground, just a few feet away. Clara followed his gaze. There, half hidden by a clump of prairie grass, was a patch of disturbed earth. It was small, barely noticeable. She knelt down, her fingers digging into the soil. Just beneath the surface, she found it. A piece of dark, oil-stained leather. It was a strip torn from a saddlebag. Samuel's saddlebag. And pressed into the dirt beside it was the clear, unmistakable imprint of a boot. Not Samuel's boot. It was larger, with a distinctive star pattern on the heel. A pattern she recognized. She'd seen it just that afternoon on the feet of Sheriff Brody. Clara looked up, her eyes wide with a terrifying understanding. The Cheyenne hadn't killed her husband. He'd seen who did. The Cheyenne's name, he told her, was Wovoka. He spoke the word softly, tapping his chest. His English was limited, broken into pieces like shards of pottery, but his meaning was crystal clear. Clara pointed to herself. Clara. He repeated her name, the sound of it strange and new on his tongue. Clara. They stood there in the charged silence, two people from different worlds, bound by a secret that was as dangerous as a coiled snake. Clara held up the piece of leather, then pointed toward the boot print. Wovoka nodded slowly. He pointed toward the path leading back to the main road. Then he made a shape with his hands. A star. The sheriff's badge. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. The sheriff hadn't come to investigate a death. He'd come to make sure his tracks were covered. Samuel wasn't kicked by a horse. He was murdered. Here. And the sheriff was the killer. But why? What was worth killing a man for? Money? The empty wallet suggested robbery, but it felt too simple. This was bigger than that. Wovoka then did something unexpected. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out a small, carved piece of bone. It was shaped like a bird, its wings spread in flight. He held it out to her. A gift. An offering of trust. Clara took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm, calloused. The connection was electric, a silent understanding that passed between them. This wasn't about a crime anymore. This was about an alliance. He pointed at the pendant, then at himself. Then he pointed at the farm, at her. His meaning was clear. I am watching. I will protect you. Before she could respond, he turned, mounted his horse, and disappeared back into the night, leaving Clara alone with the carved bird, the damning piece of leather, and a truth that could get her killed. The next day, Jack Langley came calling. He didn't bring a pie. He brought two of his hired hands, brutish men with dead eyes and guns strapped to their hips. Langley's smile was wider this time, predatory. Clara, he said, his voice slick with false charm. I heard the sheriff paid you a visit, told you my offer was a fair one. It's not for sale, Jack, Clara said, her hand resting on the porch railing, just inches from the axe she'd been using earlier. Langley's smile vanished. Don't be a fool. A woman can't run a place like this. It needs a man's hand. He took a step onto her porch. And besides, things are getting unsettled. You need protection. I have protection, Clara said, her voice like ice. Langley laughed, a short, ugly sound. That old rifle? That won't do you any good against a real threat. His eyes narrowed. The sheriff is a friend of mine, Clara. He wants what's best for this county. And what's best is for this land to be in capable hands. My hands. He was admitting it. He and the sheriff were in this together. They had murdered Samuel to get their hands on her farm. The water. It was always about the water. "Get off my land, Jack," Clara said, her voice dangerously low. One of his men took a step forward, his hand dropping to his gun. But Langley held up a hand, stopping him. He looked at Clara, a new kind of assessment in his eyes. He'd expected a grieving, helpless widow. He'd found something else entirely. "You'll change your mind," he spat, "one way or another." As they rode away, Clara knew she was running out of time. They wouldn't just threaten next time. They would act. She was a loose end, a witness to their ambition. She had to find out what they were really after. It had to be more than just land and water. Samuel was a cruel man, but he wasn't a stupid one. He must have had something they wanted, something he died for. Her search began in the one place she'd avoided since the funeral, Samuel's office. It was a small, dusty room at the back of the house, filled with ledgers, maps, and the faint, sour smell of his tobacco. She'd always hated this room. It felt like the heart of his control over her. She started with his desk, rifling through drawers filled with bills of sale for cattle, receipts for seed, the mundane paperwork of a farmer's life. Nothing. She checked under the desk, tapped the walls for hollow spots. Nothing. Her frustration grew with every passing minute. Langley and Brody wouldn't have killed a man for a simple farm deed. There was something else, a secret, hidden in plain sight. She sank into Samuel's worn leather chair, defeated. Her eyes scanned the room one last time. The bookshelf, filled with dusty almanacs and religious texts. The mounted deer head on the wall, its glass eyes staring blankly. The pot-bellied stove in the corner, cold and silent. And then she saw it. Under the stove, tucked away so it was almost completely hidden, was a small, loose floorboard. The wood around it was scuffed, the nails slightly raised, as if it had been pried up many times. Her heart leaped. With trembling hands, she used the tip of a fireplace poker to pry the board loose. Beneath it was a small, dark cavity. And inside that cavity was a locked metal box. It was heavy, solid. Whatever Samuel was hiding, it was in here. But how to open it? There was no key. She looked around the room, desperate. She tried the poker, a hammer from the woodshed. The lock wouldn't budge. Then she remembered the axe leaning against the porch railing. With a strength born of adrenaline and rage, she brought the axe down on the lock. Once, twice. On the third strike, the metal shrieked and buckled. The lid popped open. Clara stared down at the contents, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't gold. It wasn't cash. It was a ledger, a thick, leather-bound book. And beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, were two things that made her blood run cold. A stack of official-looking documents bearing the seal of the United States Army, and a detailed map, not of her farm, not of the county. It was a map of the Cheyenne territories, with specific camps and travel routes marked with chilling precision. Clara opened the ledger. The pages were filled with Samuel's cramped, precise handwriting. It wasn't a record of farm expenses. It was a list of transactions, dates, names, and numbers. But the names weren't settlers. They were Cheyenne. Names she didn't recognize, next to entries detailing payments. Payments for information. Samuel wasn't just a farmer. He was an informant. A spy for the army, selling out the very people who lived on this land. And then she saw the last few entries. They were different. They weren't about information. They were about weapons. Samuel had been brokering a secret deal. He'd been using his army contacts to acquire a shipment of new repeating rifles. He was planning to sell them to a faction of the Cheyenne, a massive, illegal arms deal that would have made him rich. But the final entry was the most damning. It was a name next to a staggering sum of money. A payoff. The name was Sheriff Brody. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Brody and Langley weren't just after her land. They were after the guns. Samuel had likely tried to cut them out of the deal, or maybe they'd decided to take it all for themselves. They'd killed him for it. And they thought she, the grieving widow, would simply sell the farm, handing them the land and whatever was hidden on it. They didn't realize she'd found their prize. But where were the rifles? They weren't in the box. They weren't in the house. She looked at the map again, her eyes tracing the lines and symbols Samuel had drawn. There was one spot, circled multiple times in red ink. A place not far from her property. A place called Shadow Canyon. That had to be it. The location of the weapons cache. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. She wasn't alone. She slammed the metal box shut, shoved it back under the floorboard, and slid the axe under the desk just as the door to the office swung open. It was Sheriff Brody, and he wasn't smiling anymore. "Looking for something, Mrs. Remington?" he asked, his voice soft and menacing. His hand was resting on the butt of his pistol. Clara's mind raced. The ledger, the map. He knew. He must have suspected Samuel kept records. He was here to find them. "Just sorting through my late husband's affairs, Sheriff," she said, her voice remarkably calm. She rose slowly from the chair, keeping the desk between them. Brody's eyes swept the room, lingering on the pot-bellied stove. He took a step inside, his gaze locking onto the floorboards. He saw the scuff marks. He saw the slightly raised nails. He knew. "Your husband was a complicated man," Brody said, his voice dropping even lower. "He got involved in things he shouldn't have, made promises he couldn't keep." He took another step. "He had something that belongs to me and Mr. Langley, something very valuable. I have a feeling you know what I'm talking about." "I have no idea," Clara lied, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Don't play dumb with me," he snarled, the friendly facade completely gone. He was a predator, cornering his prey. "We know about the guns, Clara. We know he was hiding them. Just tell us where they are, and you can walk away from this. We'll even give you a little something for your trouble." Walk away? They'd murdered her husband. They'd never let her live. "I don't know anything about any guns," she repeated, her hand inching toward the axe under the desk. Brody's patience snapped. He drew his pistol, the click of the hammer echoing in the small room. "I'm done asking nicely. You're going to tell me where those rifles are. Or so help me, you'll end up in the ground right next to Samuel." The threat was naked, real. Her time had run out. But just as he raised the pistol, a sound pierced the tense silence. A single haunting note, low and clear. It was a flute. The sound was coming from outside, near the tree line. Brody froze, his head whipping toward the window. He knew that sound. It was a Cheyenne signal. It was Wovoka. He was here. He'd been watching. The distraction was all Clara needed. In one fluid movement, she kicked the heavy desk forward. It slammed into Brody's legs, knocking him off balance. He stumbled back with a curse, his shot going wild, splintering the door frame. Clara didn't hesitate. She dove for the floor, her hand closing around the handle of the axe. She scrambled back to her feet, the weapon feeling heavy and righteous in her grip. Brody recovered quickly, his face a mask of fury. He raised his pistol again, aiming straight for her heart. But he was too slow. From the window, a dark shape flew through the air. An arrow. It struck Brody in the shoulder, sinking deep. He screamed, a sound of shock and pain, and dropped the pistol. It clattered to the floor. Clara stared, stunned, at the feathered shaft protruding from the sheriff's shoulder. Wovoka hadn't just watched. He'd acted. He'd saved her life. Brody staggered, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hatred. He stared at the window, then at Clara. He knew he was trapped. "This ain't over," he hissed, and then he turned and fled, stumbling out of the house and disappearing into the twilight. Clara stood there, chest heaving, the axe still gripped in her hand. The silence that descended was more profound than before. She ran to the window. In the distance, she could see Brody retreating, a wounded animal scurrying back to its lair. And at the tree line, the silhouette of a man on a painted horse watched for a moment longer, then melted back into the shadows. The alliance was sealed, not with a gift, but with blood. The house felt tainted now, unsafe. The sheriff would be back, and he wouldn't come alone. He'd bring Langley and his thugs. They wouldn't stop until they had the ledger and the location of the guns. Clara knew she couldn't stay. Working with a frantic urgency, she retrieved the metal box from its hiding place. She couldn't carry the heavy box, so she tore the most important pages from the ledger, the ones detailing the arms deal and Brody's payoff. She grabbed the map, stuffed the pages into her dress, and took one last look around the house that had been her prison. She grabbed a satchel, stuffing it with a loaf of bread, a canteen of water, and the carved bone bird Wovoka had given her. It felt like a talisman, a promise of a future she couldn't yet see. Just before dawn, she saddled her mare. She didn't ride east toward the town and its false safety. She didn't ride south toward the other settlements. She rode west, toward the river, toward Wovoka. She rode toward Shadow Canyon, the map clutched in her hand like a prayer. She wasn't just running away from a life she hated. She was running toward a truth she was finally ready to face. She was no longer a victim. She was a player in the game, and she held all the cards. The ride to Shadow Canyon was a desperate, breathless journey. Clara pushed her horse hard, her mind a whirlwind of fear and resolve. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like approaching hoofbeats. She was entering a world she didn't know, a land that belonged to the Cheyenne, guided by a dead man's map and a fragile, unspoken trust. She found the canyon just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the rock formations in fiery hues of orange and red. It was a narrow, deep gorge, a natural fortress carved into the earth. The entrance was almost completely hidden by a thicket of juniper and pine. She dismounted, her legs shaky. She called his name, her voice small against the vastness of the canyon. Wovoka. For a moment, there was only silence. Had she been wrong? Had she come all this way on a fool's errand? Then, he appeared. Not on his horse, but on foot, emerging from a fissure in the rock wall she hadn't even seen. He moved with a silence that was both unnerving and comforting. His face was grim, his eyes searching hers. He saw the satchel, the wildness in her eyes, the dust of her flight. "They know," she said, her voice trembling. "The sheriff. He knows I have the ledger." She pulled the crumpled pages from her dress. "He knows about the guns." Wovoka's gaze flickered to the papers in her hand. He nodded slowly, as if confirming something he already suspected. He gestured for her to follow him. He led her deep into the canyon, through a winding path that opened into a hidden encampment. It was small, just a handful of teepees nestled against the protective rock wall. A few warriors, their faces hard and watchful, stood guard. Women tended to a small fire, and children played silently in the shadows. This was his world, and she was an outsider, a ghost from another life. Wovoka spoke to his people in their own tongue, his voice low and urgent. He showed them the pages from the ledger. A ripple of understanding, of anger, passed through the small group. They looked at Clara, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. An elder, his face a road map of wrinkles and wisdom, stepped forward. He looked at Clara, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. He spoke to Wovoka, his voice a gravelly rumble. Wovoka turned back to Clara. "He asks why you are here. He says your husband betrayed our people. He sold our secrets to the soldiers. I am not my husband." Clara said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. My husband was murdered by the same men who want to destroy you. The sheriff, the man called Langley. They want the rifles your people were promised. She held out the map. And I know where they are. A tense silence fell over the camp. The warriors exchanged glances. The elder stared at her, his expression unreadable. This was the moment of truth. They could kill her as the daughter of their enemy, or they could accept her as an ally. Finally, the elder gave a single, slow nod. Wovoka let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. "We will show you," he said. He led her to the back of the canyon, to a place where a rockslide had created a small, hidden cave. The entrance was covered with a carefully arranged pile of brush. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and gun oil. There they were, crate after crate of new repeating rifles and boxes of ammunition, a small arsenal, enough to change the balance of power on the frontier. "Samuel was supposed to deliver these weeks ago," Wovoka said, his voice tight with anger. "He took the payment, but the guns never came. He was playing both sides, the army and us, waiting for the highest bidder." Now it all made sense. Brody and Langley hadn't just wanted the guns to sell. They wanted to prevent them from reaching the Cheyenne, to keep them weak and vulnerable, easier to push off their land. "What will you do now?" Clara asked. "We fight," Wovoka said simply. "Brody and Langley will come for these guns. They will bring the soldiers. They will say we stole them. They will use it as an excuse to wipe us out." He looked at her, his dark eyes intense. "But now, we have a weapon they do not expect." "What's that?" she asked. "You," he said. "You are a white woman, the widow of a man they killed. They will not expect you to stand with us. You can be our voice, our witness." The weight of his words settled on her. He wasn't just offering her sanctuary. He was offering her a role, a purpose. But before she could answer, a scout came running into the canyon, his face pale with alarm. He spoke in rapid Cheyenne, pointing back toward the entrance. Wovoka's body went rigid. "They are here," he said, his voice like stone. "The soldiers and Langley's men. They have found us." The canyon, once a sanctuary, had become a trap. The trap was sprung. Captain Hale of the U.S. Army, a man with a ramrod spine and eyes like chips of ice, led the charge. Behind him were a dozen blue-coated soldiers, their rifles at the ready. And flanking them, looking smug and triumphant, were Jack Langley and a handful of his hired guns. Sheriff Brody was with them, his arm in a sling, his face a thundercloud of vengeful fury. They blocked the only entrance to the canyon. Wovoka and his warriors took up positions behind the rocks, their own rifles aimed, their faces grim. It was a standoff, a bloodbath waiting to happen. "Wovoka!" Captain Hale's voice boomed, echoing off the canyon walls. "You are harboring a fugitive and are in possession of stolen army property. Surrender now, and you will be shown mercy." Langley laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "Don't listen to him. We know you have the guns. Give them up, and we'll let you live." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. This was it, the end of the line. They were hopelessly outnumbered. But then, she looked at the ledger pages clutched in her hand. She looked at the faces of the Cheyenne women and children huddled in the caves. She looked at Wovoka, standing tall and defiant against impossible odds, and she knew she couldn't let it end this way. She stepped out from behind the rocks. A collective gasp went through the soldiers. Captain Hale stared, his mouth agape. Langley and Brody looked like they'd seen a ghost. "Mrs. Remington!" Hale exclaimed. "What is the meaning of this? Have they taken you hostage?" "No one has taken me, Captain," Clara called out, her voice clear and steady, amplified by the canyon's acoustics. "I am here by choice." Brody's face turned purple with rage. "She's a traitor. She's in on it with them." "She's a liar!" Langley shouted. "They killed her husband and now they've turned her head." Clara ignored them. She looked directly at Captain Hale. "My husband wasn't killed by the Cheyenne, Captain. He was murdered by Sheriff Brody and Jack Langley." A murmur went through the soldiers. They looked from Clara to their captain, then to the sputtering sheriff and the furious landowner. Doubt had been planted. "That's a ridiculous accusation," Hale blustered, but his confidence was shaken. "Is it?" Clara held up the ledger pages. "I have proof. Samuel Remington's own ledger. It details his work as an informant for you, Captain, but it also details his illegal arms deal, and the payoff he took from Sheriff Brody to look the other way while they planned to steal these guns for themselves." She took a step forward, her eyes blazing. "They didn't want the guns to sell them, Captain. They wanted to make sure the Cheyenne never got them. They wanted them weak, and they murdered my husband to cover their tracks." Captain Hale's face was a mask of confusion and fury. He looked at Brody, whose face had gone pale. He looked at Langley, who was sweating profusely despite the cool air. "This is absurd," Brody yelled. "She's lying to protect the savages." "Then let's test the theory," Clara said, her voice dropping, carrying a deadly weight. "You came for stolen army property, Captain. Well, here it is." She turned and gestured to the Cheyenne warriors. At her signal, they began dragging the crates of rifles out from the cave, piling them in the open. "These guns were part of an unsanctioned, illegal deal brokered by my husband," Clara announced. "He betrayed the army and he betrayed the Cheyenne. He is dead. The debt is paid. Take the rifles. They are yours." Captain Hale stared at the mountain of weapons. This was what he had come for. His mission was complete. Langley and Brody looked horrified. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Their prize was being given away. Their whole scheme was unraveling. "But what about them?" Langley shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Wovoka. "They're still savages. They conspired with a traitor." Clara turned her iciest gaze on him. "They conspired with no one. They were betrayed, just like the army. They have broken no laws. They are on their own land, and they have a witness to the murder of a white man. Me." She looked back at Captain Hale. "You have your guns, Captain. You have the truth. And you have a choice. You can believe the word of a corrupt sheriff and a greedy land grabber, or you can believe the evidence in my hand and the testimony of a grieving widow." She held out the ledger pages. "The choice is yours, justice or a cover-up." The canyon was silent. The soldiers looked at their captain, waiting. Wovoka and his warriors stood ready, their rifles still aimed, but their eyes were on Clara, filled with a dawning awe. Captain Hale was a soldier, a man of rules and regulations, but he was not a fool. He saw the truth in Clara's eyes. He saw the guilt on Brody's face. He saw the greed dripping from Langley. He made his decision. "Sheriff Brody," he said, his voice like iron. "Mr. Langley, you are both under arrest for suspicion of murder and conspiracy against the United States Army." Brody and Langley stared in disbelief as two soldiers stepped forward, leveling their rifles at them. Their protests died in their throats. Justice, swift and unexpected, had arrived in Shadow Canyon. In the aftermath, the canyon was quiet. The soldiers loaded up the confiscated rifles, their movements efficient and subdued. Brody and Langley were bound and led away, their faces a picture of defeated rage. The war was over before a single shot was fired in battle. Captain Hale approached Clara, the ledger pages in his hand. He looked at her with a newfound respect. "Mrs. Remington," he said, "you are a remarkable woman. You will be required to give a formal testimony, of course, but your property is secure. No one will trouble you again." He glanced over at Wovoka, who stood watching them, his expression unreadable. "As for these people, under the circumstances, my report will state that the stolen property was recovered without incident. There will be no further action taken against them." It was an unofficial truce, a peace bought with truth and courage. After the soldiers left, A strange and peaceful quiet settled over the canyon. The Cheyenne began to pack their belongings. Their sanctuary had been revealed. They could not stay. They would move on, deeper into the wilderness, to a place the white man had not yet spoiled. Wovoka came to Clara. They stood together, watching the last of the sunlight fade from the canyon rim. "You are safe now," he said. "And you?" she asked. "Where will you go?" "The land will show us the way," he replied. "We always find a way." He looked at her, a question in his eyes that he did not speak aloud. Clara knew what he was asking. She could go back to her farm, to her old life. A life of solitude, yes, but a life of safety and independence. A life she had earned, or she could go with them, into the unknown, into a world without fences, without deeds, without the rules that had almost choked the life out of her. She looked at her farm in her mind's eye. The house, the fields, the silence. It was hers, free and clear. But it was also a ghost of a life she no longer wanted. She turned and looked at the faces of the people around her. They were strangers, their language and customs foreign to her. But in their eyes, she saw a strength, a resilience, a connection to the world that she had only just begun to understand. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the small carved bone bird. She held it in her palm, a gift, an offering of trust. She looked at Wovoka, and for the first time since her husband's death, she smiled. A real smile, bright and fearless. "I think," she said softly, "the land will show me the way too." No one back in the settlement ever knew the full truth. They heard that Sheriff Brody and Jack Langley had been arrested by the army for some dark conspiracy. They heard that Clara Remington, the quiet widow, had simply vanished. Some said the Indians took her. Others whispered she'd lost her mind and wandered into the wilderness. Her farm lay empty, a silent testament to the woman who had refused to break. But Clara Remington hadn't vanished. She hadn't been taken. She had been found. Riding alongside Wovoka with the wind in her hair and a world of possibilities stretched out before her, she was no longer a widow. She was no longer a victim. She was not a traitor or a hero. She was just free. And her real story was just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more tales of justice and survival from the forgotten corners of history. And let me know in the comments, what do you think happened to Clara next?